Okay, we should be recording. So welcome everybody, happy Monday, yay! It's Monday and it's Research Administrator, I'm going to call it week, even though it's really Research Administrator Day is on Friday. It's kind of like my birthday. I take a birthday month, not a birthday day. And so I tell my family gifts need to start September 1 and end on September 30th. So I'm still within my birthday month and we are in Research Administrator Week, which reminds me that at the end of the week, we have Jeff Ritchie he's an emeritus member of the Research Advisory Certification Council, the RACC, and he will be with us on Friday. I believe it's from 11 to 2:30 on Mountain Daylight Time, and he will do a condensed version of the CRA overview. So typically it's a day-long workshop. He's going to give us a condensed version free of charge because in his words, he likes to talk about the CRA. So we are fortunate that he is giving us his time on Friday. I hope y'all can join. I will try to remember to record that if that's okay with him to record it as well. So last we ended up, we were talking about indirect costs and what went into the indirect cost pools. Did folks get a chance, if you had not already watched the Idaho video or the video that Kim Melville Smith reminded us of, which relates F&A costs to the chicken sandwich? And what were your thoughts on that? Was there anything new? Was there anything that really kind of stood out for you in either of those videos or any comments in general?
I think one thing for me that really stood out was the effective F&A rate, and actually just to step back a whole level from that, the effort that the University of Idaho went to educate people
Right.
just inside their own institution, that just really kind of hit me hard. And I think the whole idea of effective F&A rate, and then the man that spoke at the end of that video who talked about process changes that could be made that would benefit the university, for example, looking at balancing cost share awards with non-cost share awards and looking at the overall cost to the institution. I thought that was really well done and something that would be beneficial where I work.
Great. Great, thank you for sharing. Yeah, it is kind of and I love like the way the tires come to a screeching halt when they talk about that effective rate, right? So we're not ever recovering our full amount. Even when we negotiate our rates, we typically don't negotiate to what we really could get. We negotiate a lower percentage with our cognizant agency. So right there, we're already being reduced. Plus sponsors then put caps on us and reduce. So there are a lot of things that impact that effective rate. I know people at our institution have asked what our effective rate is, and I honestly don't remember, but of course it's lower than what the actual rate is. So thank you for sharing. Other comments? I'm trying to find oh, there's my chat. Okay, sorry, I wanted to be able to see the chat in case anybody was commenting there, but I don't see any comments there. So I'm going to go ahead and just cover the 3 different types of indirect costs on this slide, or indirect cost rate agreement types. So we have modified total direct cost and salaries and wages. So typically you might see a negotiated indirect cost agreement rate, a NICRA, be a modified total direct cost where there are certain exclusions to the cost, such as equipment or participant support costs or tuition. It depends on what is in your negotiated rate, those exclusions, but typically they are things like any amount after the first $25,000 of a sub-award, of a single sub-award. Again, equipment, tuition, those kind of things. You might be at an institution that's a salary and wage-based institution where you apply your percentage only on salaries and wages. That does not include fringes. When I was at Western Kentucky University, we were salary and wage based, and actually while I was there, we went to MTDC. So I got for the first time to get the fun of calculating in TDC, where I had been only calculating indirect on salaries and wages, which is way easier to do. I don't know of any institutions that actually have a total direct cost negotiated rate. There might be nonprofits that have that type of rate, but you might see sponsors say you can only take indirect on total direct cost. Okay, and usually then they are reducing, they're not letting us use our rate, or they might put in language that says something like, you can use the lesser of your negotiated rate or, you know, total direct cost. So they want you to use the lesser of those. So are there any institutions out there that are using a salary and wage base? Are any of you at those institutions?
SUU is salary, wage, and benefit base.
Okay. And it's easy, right?
Oh, yeah.
Isn't it great? It's great, particularly because, you know, most of our budgets are very heavy in personnel cost, right? It really kind of hits us when we have just equipment grants, but equipment's typically excluded anyway from indirect costs. So, and Sylvia, I'm sure you're used to the MTDC because I assume that you do a lot of relationships with other institutions that are under MTDC.
That is correct.
Okay.
That is something we are constantly having to revisit.
Okay.
All the time.
All the time. So for the purposes of the exam, you may have to actually calculate indirect costs based on different types of rates. So if you had this information, if you had that a budget was 200,000 direct cost, of that, 50,000 were salaries and wages, you had 20,000 worth of equipment, 2,000 in participant support, and you had two subawards, one for 20,000, one for 30,000, okay? Could you go ahead and calculate then, let's start with calculating on total direct cost. What would the base be that you would apply your total direct cost percentage? And don't worry that these numbers don't add up to 200. I gave you that 200,000 was direct cost. You have the information you need to answer the question. So what would the base be? Let's say your total direct cost is limited to 10%. What would you be applying 10% to? What amount? Given this information.
So you are saying that the salaries and wages
Total direct cost.
Okay, I'm sorry. What was the question, Sylvia?
This is just to clarify, you are saying that the equipment, salaries, wages, and participant support and subawards are on top of the direct costs? Or
no, they are included within.
Okay.
They're included within. So assume there's other costs that bring it up to 200,000. So the amount is 200,000, and within that you have some of these additional costs, or some of these costs that are subsumed in there. So I heard the answer earlier. Somebody chimed in. What is the amount that you're going to apply your 10% to? If the
I say 200.
There you go, 200, and also Corinne wrote it in there. So yeah, it's direct cost. You look at what your direct cost is, you don't take any exclusions, and you just multiply whatever percentage the agency is saying they limit to. So in this case, we would multiply 10% by the 200,000. It doesn't matter how much you have in equipment, doesn't matter how much you have in participant support. What matters is your direct cost. Now, how about for Sylvia's institution that's on the salary and wages base? What would the base be? Let's say her, what is actually your indirect cost rate for on-campus research?
45% of salaries, wages, and benefits.
Okay, well, we're just going to look at salaries and wages because I didn't include benefits on here. So, I'm sorry, what'd you say, you're 45%? So 45% of salaries and wages. So what would we apply the 45% to? What amount?
50,000.
50,000. But in Sylvia's case, at her institution, it's actually salaries, wages, and they would include fringes. I've never seen one. Yeah, this is why I always say, like when I say total direct costs, I've never seen an institution because as soon as I say that, somebody will go, oh, well, my institution's on total direct costs. I have never seen an institution. I've been in research administration since 1998. I was at salaries and wage-based institutions before this. I've never seen one that included fringe benefits in their rates, but yours does.
It sure does.
So if you've seen one fringe benefit rate, or if you've seen one F&A rate, you've seen one F&A rate. But yes, so no for salaries and wages, if that is the type of indirect cost rate, in this example, you would be applying the percentage to 50,000. Okay. Now, what if it was modified total direct cost? If it was modified total direct cost, what would the base be that we would apply our percentage? So let's go with 52%. If we were applying 52%, what amount? Whoopsie, let me go back. What amount would we be applying?
178.
Well, except for the subcontracts.
So we would exclude 20,000 in equipment. Somebody have a calculator handy here? Let's do the math together. You would take your 200,000 direct cost. You would take out 20,000 worth of equipment, right? Then we're going to take out 2,000 of participant support cost, right? So that has us down to 7,800. But now we have two subawards. Are we going to exclude any amount of the first subaward? No, because it's 20,000. It's only amounts over 25,000. Are we going to exclude part of the second subaward?
Yeah.
So we're going to take out how much? 5,000 for that.
5,000.
Which leaves us with 173,000 as our base. Okay, so you may have to do those calculations, but you will be given all the information that you need to be given. And they could throw extraneous information in there, which I didn't do just to confuse you. So maybe they put some other support cost in there. So just be cautious. Questions about the indirect cost rate types? Okay. Cost sharing. Let's talk about cost sharing. So we spent time last time we were together, it seems like months ago, but last Monday, we spent time going through direct cost elements and indirect costs, all that make up our total project costs. So if you have a piece of paper and a writing utensil handy, I would like you to draw a great big circle on your sheet of paper and write in some typical costs that you would find in a budget. Typical cost categories like you did last time. What kind of project costs do you typically encounter? If you want to write them in the chat, you can do that as well.
I am doing right now a UO3
Okay.
clinical trial, and it's on NIH, and it requires one-to-one match.
One-to-one match. Yep. Thank you for sharing that.
And my head is going in 20,000 directions.
I bet. I bet.
I'd be delighted to hear this conversation.
Okay. Okay, so if you could unmute yourself and tell me some of the different costs that you have in your circle.
Salaries and benefits.
Salaries and benefits. Okay.
Travel.
Travel.
Materials and supplies.
Materials and supplies.
Subaward.
Subawards. Okay. Great. So now I want you to take your writing utensil, and if you had salaries and wages, cross that out, because that's not an allowable cost according to my sponsor. My fictitious sponsor is not going to allow salaries and wages. Okay. But we know effort is expended on a grant, so now all of a sudden we have a cost share situation, right? If the sponsor isn't allowing it, those total project costs have to come from somewhere, right? And those costs then are going to be borne by the institution. So actually the definition of cost sharing is the portion of costs not paid for by federal funds. So in this fictitious example, if the agency won't pay for them, they have to come from somewhere. They're still true costs to the project. Okay, so we have to then come up with those costs. So that would be an example where we have to cost share those salaries and wages. Okay. So the next slide just shows a graphic of this, that all your project costs are made up of direct and indirect costs. But any of those total project costs that the sponsor will not provide are some type of institutional obligation or cost share. So we take a little hunk out of there, right? And that would be our cost share. Okay. Different types of cost share that you might encounter are listed here. There could be mandatory cost share, meaning it's a condition of the award. So in the case, Carmen, I think that was you that just shared that you are working on an NIH that has a one-to-one match, right?
Correct.
That's required as a condition of the award.
Correct.
You all have to put up, for every dollar that you want to draw down from the NIH, you have to contribute $1. Okay. Or $100,000, right?
Actually, this
Depending
is
upon
$3 million.
$3 million. Wow.
So the project will end up being $6,700,000.
Okay. So your total project costs are $6 million, and half of that will come from the NIH, and half of that you either as an institution you have to bring to the table, or you have to get a third party to bring to contribute those costs.
An outside third party pay.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So mandatory cost share requires a condition of the award. Voluntary is when it's not required as a condition of the award, but an institution volunteers some cost share, and there could be a couple different reasons why. Sometimes our investigators think it will increase our their competitive advantage. Okay. Or it could be maybe they're just bumping up into some type of sponsor ceiling or cap, and they really have more project costs than the program they're applying to can support. Kind of the purpose, like if I was teaching this in fundamentals of sponsor research, I would say as a pre-award administrator, you should talk with your faculty about reducing their scope of their project and looking at ways to not have to provide cost share. For the purposes of this, for the CRA study group, you just really need to know the different types rather than kind of like the best practices. But it's hard for me not to throw in best practices there. Okay. What I want to say on mandatory and voluntary is it doesn't matter whether it's mandatory cost share required by the sponsor or if it's voluntarily contributed by the submitting organization. If it is included in the proposal and required as a condition of the award, it's committed cost share. And with committed cost share, we have to track that at the institution, and we have to report that to the sponsoring agency. That's one reason why we try not to do voluntary committed cost share. The other reason is additional cost share from the institution, as we saw last week, will actually drive down your F&A rate during rate negotiations. So we try not to do it. I think it's difficult. I was in pre-award most of my career to not get faculty to do it, especially when they're hung up on that idea. It's to increase a competitive advantage. Once you start talking with them about, well, then you're going to have to, especially if they're using effort of their own effort or effort of other people on the project, we say, well, you're going to have to do more effort certification then on all this. We're going to have to document this. And then all of a sudden, when that becomes a burden to them, you can actually get them to back off of that voluntary cost share. So cost sharing or matching. What does uniform guidance say about cost sharing or matching? It says, under federal research proposals, voluntary committed cost sharing is not expected. So when our investigators say, oh, it will help increase the competitiveness of my proposal, it is not supposed to, because it cannot be used as a factor during the merit review of applications or proposals. Okay. That was something new that was written in uniform guidance that was not in the former OMB circulars. So we can point to our faculty again, whether they listen to us or not. Typically, if you tell them they're going to have to do more work as a result of voluntary cost share, that speaks to them more so than this does. So, questions?
I have a question.
Please.
I never, I mean, I have worked on these issues for so many years, and this is the first time when I realized that the cost share, they don't charge F&A. So when NIH is telling me that it's 1-to-1 and my F&A is 55.5%, it really gives me a greater and higher direct cost on the portion of the matching. So I end up using the 55% that shows on my budget that is going to go into F&A, because F&A, I mean, matching doesn't charge F&A.
So you're saying that it's on direct costs only that they're,
Yes.
okay, yeah. And I think that would vary sponsor to sponsor, right?
Oh.
And program to program.
Well, I don't like matching as much as I like. Is not fun at all.
No.
I hate it, and it's a lot of work.
It is a lot of work, and it can be tricky. Sometimes it can be straightforward, but oftentimes I think it can be really tricky, particularly if it's on the direct cost cap. I want to go back here to cost sharing or matching. Uniform guidance uses both words, and when it defines cost sharing, it says cost sharing or matching. Be cautious, because sometimes different agencies use these words differently, particularly humanities and art agencies might use matching to mean that for every dollar they provide, you as the institution have to leverage funds and raise funds, typically outside the institution, to match the agency funds. So if you listen to public radio, this goes on all the time, right? There might be a segment where public radio says, oh, we have a corporate sponsor, and for this next hour, for every dollar that we raise, from you, the listener, they're going to match. That's what these agencies want you to do. We see this a lot with NIH challenge grants. The challenge there is to take the NIH's Monday, National Endowment for Humanities, leverage those funds and raise outside funds. So often, while this is a sponsored programs, you might be working very closely with your development office to actually do a capital campaign to leverage those funds. So just realize that some agencies might mean matching as outside third party leveraging funds. Okay, one thing to be very mindful, you saw this last time when we started talking about budget, that cost allowability. I showed you this on cost allowability. Cost share must be allowable. Just like items that you're asking for in your budget have to be allowable, your cost share must be allowable. If an item is unallowable as a direct cost to the budget, then it's likely unallowable as cost share, and that's something that you need to clarify with your sponsor. So for example, if a sponsor says, we don't allow charging of salaries and wages, but we have mandatory cost share, you might not be able to use your salaries and wages to meet the cost share requirement. Oftentimes we might see an agency, particularly a non-federal agency, say, we don't allow indirect costs. And again, if there's a cost share requirement, that means that you might not be able to use those unrecovered indirect costs to meet your cost share requirement. So always make sure, if it's not in the guidance, that you've checked with your sponsor and you have some type of written communication on cost allowability for cost share. This got me into big trouble when I started out in research administration a long time ago. I'm telling you, everything I learned because I screwed something up. We had a very, very large proposal go in that did not allow salaries and wages. And it had a cost share requirement. And I thought, well, no brainer. We use all of that effort as cost share. So we proposed it that way. The sponsor funded it, and then they showed up physically at our institution and said, by the way, all of that effort that you put in there as cost share, you can't use, because we said salaries and wages were unallowable cost. So it was a very large, prestigious award. So we were kind of stuck with, do we now scramble to come up with a cost share, or do we turn down the award? And we scrambled to come up with a cost share, and I made sure ever since then, whenever cost share was required, that I was using something that was an allowable cost. It never dawned on me at that time, new in research administration, that I couldn't use those costs. But the sponsor was basically saying they're unallowable on that program. We run into this, we might run into this, say, with an NIH program for any salary over the salary cap. Salary over the salary cap is considered an unallowable cost. So you probably can't use, I say probably, probably can't use it to meet a cost share requirement unless the sponsor agency gives prior approval. Okay, that's something to be cautious about.
Yep.
You live and learn, you own up, and you hope you keep your job and move on.
Yes.
That's how it, okay. Here is a question that was submitted by one of you, and this was a timely place to include this question. So an FOA, remember, funding opportunity announcement, does not require cost share. The PI lists 2 months of effort in the budget, but only requests 1 month of compensation. So the PI basically tells the agency, I'm going to work for 2 months, but you only have to reimburse me for 1. The extra month of uncharged effort is considered A, voluntary uncommitted cost share, B, voluntary committed cost share, C, mandatory cost share, or D, a great strategy to sway reviews to recommend funding. Whether you're, I barely even turned around, I see all these B's. B's, that's correct, voluntary committed cost share. Right? Because they have mentioned in the budget or budget justification, wherever it is, that they're going to be putting this much effort. So thank you for submitting that question. Appreciate it. Okay, a couple other budget considerations. Michael, PIs think it's D. You're correct. PIs do think it's D. So, okay, other budget considerations, things that you'll see or may see on the exam. Okay, some sponsors may have agency limitations, such as limitations on the amount of F&A that can be recovered, training, or even on program type. So training grants typically will limit F&A to 8%. The NSF 2-month rule on proposed annual salary. So NSF typically limits proposed salary to 2 months across all NSF proposals in a given year. It's kind of a general policy that they have for senior personnel. Does that mean that you can never propose that? No. You can still propose it if you have special circumstances that you can justify. We'll talk about salary cap in a different slide and the modular budget here in another slide. Okay, salary cap. DHHS Salary Cap is a congressionally mandated salary limit on grants, contracts, cooperative agreements for DHHS agencies. So I wrote some examples of DHHS agencies there. The cap is set yearly according to the executive level pay scale. So know that it changes yearly. What I put in the slides today may be changed. Actually, I actually meant to go back to see if this was the current cap. Could be changed. It could be changed by the time that you take the exam. I don't know that they would keep the exam updated to actually have the salary cap. You should at least be aware that there's a salary cap, and then yearly you should go out and look at that salary cap. So the current cap, I believe, is 197.3. Been raised. Go ahead and let me know. So what that means is if you have an investigator who gets paid over that amount, if their institutional base salary is over that amount, so in this example, their salary is $225,000, you can only budget on that cap, the 197.3. So even though they're only putting 10% of their time in this example, and you're saying, well, 10% of 225 is under the cap, it doesn't matter. That institutional base salary is what you're looking at when you're seeing, does that amount go over the cap? If the answer is yes, then you have to do your budgeting of effort based on the current cap. Okay. So now, some DHS agencies will say, depending upon the type of budget, let's say it's an NIH detail budget, that they actually want you to budget at the proposal stage using the actual salary, using the actual IBS, but at the time of award, the agency will reduce the amount of award to the cap. Okay. That's for detailed budgets with NIH. For NIH modular budgets, you're actually supposed to budget using the cap and not using whatever IBS is in place at the time. So that can be a little confusing. You can also get program officers who are unclear about that and may push back and try to get you to budget at the cap. So this is something that institutions kind of do differently. Some institutions say, well, if we know we can't get paid over the cap, we're going to budget at the cap. Other institutions may say, well, I'm going to go ahead and use the actual salary in place, because that way if the cap increases between time of submission and time of award, then we're guaranteed that increase. It really, that comes down to institutional culture. And so that's not going to be on the exam which way you should do it, but you should at least know that for NIH, for the detailed budgets, you should budget actual. For a modular budget, you should use the salary cap.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Does Department of Defense have a $250,000 cap?
Department of Defense. I don't know if Department of Defense has, that wouldn't be a I mean, it would be a salary cap, but not according to this pay scale. It sounds like maybe they have a cap in general. Does somebody else know the answer to that?
Because I submitted a budget for, it was a $3 million budget, and I was originally following the NIH salary cap, and DOD told me to follow the 250K cap.
I wonder if that was a particular program cap that they had in place.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't know. DOD doesn't fall under the agencies that use the DHHS cap, so I don't know if that could have been a particular program.
Okay. Thank you.
So the next slide actually shows the agencies that are under that cap. So AHRQ, CDC, HRSA, NIH, and SAMHSA. Okay. Yeah, I don't know about, I honestly don't know about that one. So DOD, I'm writing it down though. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sure. Okay, I alluded to modular budget, that when you are proposing a modular budget and you're trying to get to your closest $25,000 module, that you should actually be using the salary cap. So what the modular budget is, it's a mechanism used for NIH research grants. That's key to know. It's for research grants with direct costs up to $250,000 in any given year. Okay, so if you go over 250 in any given year, then you should use a detailed budget unless your solicitation says otherwise. So with a modular budget, you're estimating costs to the closest 250K increment or module. That's why it's called a modular budget. And these came about, so these were coming in vogue about the time I got into research administration. And at the time, I was told that the reason for the modular budget was to blind reviewers to salary information and to information in the budget. NIH at the time was saying the reviewers were getting really hung up during the review on the budget and nitpicking the budget and questioning the budget, that they just kind of wanted the reviewers blind to that information. They didn't want them to know what their colleagues were making at other institutions, that they really just wanted the review to be focused on the scientific merit of the proposal. So they came up with this 250 increment. It's been that way since like 98, whenever this, it's at least been since like 98 or 99. They haven't changed that amount. So with this type of budget, the reviewers don't see the details, and you don't include cost estimates in your budget justification. The only thing that you include in the justification is a personnel justification. Anybody that is getting paid off that award, you have to include their name, their role on the project, the number of person months that they will be working on the project. And you can talk, so the number of person months will allude to how much effort they're putting on the project. No salary or fringe benefit rate should be included, and you're not doing justifications for supplies and equipment and travel and all of that. Now, if you have a subaward, you will include your subaward cost rounded to the nearest $1,000 for each subaward, or what NIH calls a consortium. So if you see the language with NIH consortium and consortium justification, they're talking what we're typically calling a subaward there. And you have to tell the NIH if the consortium is domestic or a foreign entity. Okay. And there may also be an additional justification that you have to provide. For example, if there are variations in the number of the modules that you are requesting. So typically they like you to request the same number of modules each year. So let's say it's a 5-year project. In year 1, you're requesting 4 modules, but in years 2 through 5, you're only requesting 3 $25,000 modules. Sorry, I just realized that this should have been costs are estimated to the nearest 25,000 K increment. I stuck an extra 0 in there. So you're requesting $25,000 modules up to a 250K limit. So cross that out on your slide, that extra 0 right there. Okay. So it could be the case that your investigator is purchasing equipment in year 1, so therefore they need an additional module in year 1. Maybe in a later year they're doing a lot of travel, and so they have an additional module there. So if you're requesting uneven modules, you have to provide a justification for doing so. So again, you don't provide the typical detailed budget justification. Instead, it's just a personnel justification, a justification for any consortiums, and any justification for uneven modules. So, questions or comments there? I have to write a note to myself to change my slide, that 250. I love doing modular budgets. Yes.
Yes.
On the modular budgets for the R21 anyway, because it's 275, you do not have to justify why the difference.
Oh, correct. So yeah, there is a NIH mechanism where in 1 year they allow for an uneven module, and you do not have to make a justification for that, because they realize that in 1 year you've requested a certain number, in the other it's an uneven module. So you're correct, you do not have to make that justification. Thank you. One thing, if you're a school that applies to R15s, Sylvia, I assume your school maybe applies to some R15s. So with that, so they increase that program amount up to 300K, right? And so if your investigators actually go for the 300K, they have to then provide a detailed budget. I used to have investigators that would always just go to the 250, so that way they didn't have to provide the detailed budget. So, and again, institutional differences. Some institutions may require internally a detailed budget, but they submit the modular to the NIH. Okay, that's something that varies institution to institution, so not something that you'll see on the exam. Okay, modular budget. Then just a quick word about budget justifications for detailed budgets. Okay, a budget justification, also called a budget narrative, is where you're giving a description of the proposed costs. Why do you have to have travel? Where are you traveling to? What are you traveling for? Is it for collecting data? Is it for disseminating results? Okay, where are you going to travel? Particularly, is it domestic travel or foreign travel? Many of our federal sponsors make us make a distinction between domestic and foreign travel in our budgets. Okay, so why do we need these costs? We have our investigator in there for 10% effort. What are they doing? What are their roles and responsibilities? We have a graduate student in there for 100% effort. What is that graduate student contributing to the project? We have to explain that in words. So it's not just cutting and pasting our numbers, right? It's actually providing a justification for how we came up with the numbers and why we need those cost items. So we're explaining our basis for how we're estimating the cost, because at the time of proposal, we're doing an estimation of what our costs may be. Sometimes 5 years out, our investigators don't know if their conference is going to be foreign or domestic. That's something that we might explain in the justification, that every year it alters, whether it's a foreign or domestic location. So maybe we've gone ahead and budgeted for a foreign site just to be covered. Here is an example of what you might see written in a budget justification. Again, Professor Owens, their role on the project is the PI, the effort. This is in calendar months, which would be an NIH proposal. And then what Dr. Owens is going to be doing. Dr. Owens is responsible for overall coordination of the project. You probably say more than that, brevity here for the purpose of this slide. Again, justification for the travel may say $3,000 requested per year for the PI to travel to professional conferences. So one thing that you all, I don't know if you all are monitoring that there are some changes to uniform guidance coming out. And one thing that uniform guidance might be looking at is publication charges that occur in early years of the grant, because typically somebody is not going to be publishing that soon. So publication charges should be in the later years of a grant, like in the last year, and whereas equipment charges should be typically early in the grant, unless there's justification for buying equipment later in the grant. So I think we're going to see some changes to when we are budgeting and making justifications for certain items of cost with uniform guidance. So that's something to stay tuned for. Okay, so you've already done your homework, yay. So what we're going to do now is just go through the Q&A so you have the answers, and then we're going to move into the section that we're supposed to be covering today on proposal review. So some of this was from last week, but I'm sure you all will have all of these. Let me skip the acronym review. Okay, which of the following is true about cost allowability on federal awards? A, they must be necessary and reasonable. B, they have to conform to sponsor limitations. C, they should be accorded consistent treatment. Or D, all of the above. And you all are correct. The answer is D. So if you go back to those 4 blocks that I have in the slides, that's what we're talking about there, cost allowability. Which of the following is an example of a typically allowable direct cost? The PI salary, administrative salary, computing device, or all of the above? Okay, so A, I see lots of A's, right? So administrative salaries, we typically capture as indirect costs, though we can have a justification for including them as a direct cost. And we also talked about computing devices, how they have to be integral to the work being done. Which of the following is an example of participant support cost? A, a graduate student salary. B, human subject incentive payment. C, travel to attend a U.S. Department of Education supported workshop for teacher education. Or D, all of the above. And I see Kelly's chimed in C there. And she is correct, right? So typically participant support is for a trainee. A graduate student is typically not a trainee, right? If they are part of a trainee program, that could be different, but if they're just working in a lab and getting some experience, they're usually considered an employee and not a participant. A researcher at Stanford is running samples in her recharge center and sending the results back to CSU. Okay, in this case, the Stanford University is a prime awardee, a subrecipient, a consultant, or a vendor. So the institution, not the investigator. Okay, D, probably a vendor. And remember, the onus is on us to make that determination at the pre-award stage. How about in this case, the researcher at Stanford is going to be running samples in her recharge center, analyzing the data, and is a co-PI on the project. In this case, Stanford is a prime awardee, a subrecipient, a consultant, or a vendor. right? Now a sub-recipient because they're doing a substantial part of the work and contributing to the science. An investigator responding to an NIH solicitation that allows up to $300K per year is only requesting $250K per year. Which budget type should be used? A detailed, a modular, a consortium, or an additional? Okay, a modular budget because they're only requesting $250K. If in any year they've requested up to that $300K, it switches it and they would have to use a detailed budget. An agency limits direct costs to $200,000. Institutional F&A is 45%. How much in direct costs can be charged to the grant? It was supposed to be tricky, but you all got it right away, right? 200,000. It doesn't matter what your F&A is. If the agency limits to 200,000, that's what you can charge to the grant. Okay, and you will see questions like that are seemingly tricky on the exam, so make sure you read carefully. An agency limits total cost to 200,000. Institutional F&A is 45. If full F&A is charged, how much is available in for direct cost? Okay, so I see lots of C's. That is correct. So you take that 200,000 and divide by 1.45 to back into that number. Oops. And again, you may have to do that calculation. So if you're not somebody that's used to doing that calculation, get used to doing that. It's just a simple divide by 1 point whatever the F&A rate is. The administrative cap on a federally negotiated F&A for institutes of higher education is equal to what percentage? A, B, C, or D? I see lots of C's. That is correct. It's the 26%, which happens to also be typically our off-campus rate, right? Because with off-campus, then we are only using administration. We are not using the facilities. What is the effect of building a new research facility on the F&A rate? Does it increase it, decrease it for a year, then decrease it, or no effect? And I see some A's. A is correct. What year was FFATA signed into law? Yes, you'll need to know some dates. And this is the part of the exam I hate because I don't remember numbers at all. See if you all remember. Okay. The answer is 2006. Okay. What is the effect of providing institutional cost share on the F&A rate? It increases it, decreases it. It decreases it, B. And that's it on those. Any questions there on the information from the budget slides that we just finished up? I then am going to pull up the next slides. Can you see the next slides? Yes, you see the green cram study group. Okay, because we're cramming this all in. Okay, so no questions, then we're going to move on to the proposal. We're going to talk a little bit about grant submission, proposal review, and what happens between when you submit it and it's reviewed and an award is made. So some of that just-in-time information, which really kind of falls somewhat under 3 and before number 4. So we're still early on in this life cycle. Proposal review. Okay. Typical areas of review that we need to comply with. Any requirements in the program, right? Any agency requirements, any program requirements. So it could be things like page limitations, font limitations, all of the elements that have to be included in the proposal and the format for those elements, the correct number of copies I'm kind of laughing because, again, back in the day when we had actually put these through the copier, deadline dates, receipt dates, submission times now in the electronic world, any budget considerations, like if the sponsor has a budget limitation or if they require mandatory cost share. So we need to be reviewing either in the departments or centrally, but before we submit our proposals, we should be reviewing and make sure we're in compliance with all of those proposal or programmatic requirements. Okay. We absolutely need to make sure that we as an institution meet eligibility requirements and that our investigator meets any eligibility requirements. Okay. Anything else? Oh, and then, being mindful of how the agency wants to receive the proposal and also when they want to receive it. So if it has to be date stamped by, I love to listen to Jean Feltman say her 5001, right? You go that second or millisecond after, and research.gov is going to kick you out. Other typical areas of review, limited submissions. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. The two areas in here are under just-in-time information, typically with sponsors, meaning that often we don't have to have these reviews or compliance in place at time of submission, but we have to have them in place at time of award. So I'll talk a little bit more about just in time. Again, I already mentioned cost share institutional commitments. I have a lot of slides on conflict of interest, and Kim Melville Smith, I meant to tell you that you're welcome to chime in on anything on the conflict of interest that you feel like chiming in on. And then thank you. And then reviewing any kind of subcontractor information or even subawardee information. And we'll talk a little bit more about the small business subcontracting plan as well and when that kicks in. Go. And then more areas of review. We might internally look to see if there are space needs in light of an award coming in or renovation needs. So if your investigator is proposing to buy a great big piece of equipment, where's this great big piece of equipment going to go? Does a building actually have to be renovated to put that equipment in that space? So that's something that we're typically reviewing and looking at internally. When we are working with the federal government, we're making promises that we are not debarred or suspended as an institution, or that our investigators on those awards are not debarred or suspended from doing work with the federal government. We'll talk more about lobbying today, about we cannot use federal funds to pay for lobbyists. I know I'm whipping through this really quickly, but there are slides on a lot of this. Export control and foreign national restrictions, we'll talk a little bit about that. Executive Order 12372, those of you in Colorado might not be familiar with it because Colorado does not have to comply with, or we've kind of opted out of this, of having a single point of contact review for our state. And then we'll talk a little bit about signatures and certifications. So a lot to cover. We'll also talk a little bit about merit review process. And let's get started. Okay, so first of all, program limitations. A program might limit the number of proposals that an institution can submit. So many of our institutions will have some type of limited submission program. At CSU, it's the Research Acceleration Office that handles our limited submission program. So if an agency is saying your institution can only submit 2 proposals, we want to make sure that we're putting our best 2 proposals forward. And by best 2, I mean the 2 that are most likely to be funded, right? Have the highest chances of being funded. So what institutions will do is they will review proposals internally. Who reviews the proposals, the systems they use for reviewing proposals, or the process varies institution to institution. So, but most institutions will have something in place rather than a first come, first serve, because they want to make sure that they put the competitive proposal forward. So an example of a limited submission program is the NSF Major Research Instrumentation Program. The National Endowment for Humanities Summer Fellowship is another example of a limited submission program. So that's something that particularly people in pre-award want to be reviewing the solicitation for to see if it's a limited program. An agency might have limits on the type of institution that can apply. So for example, it could be that only for-profits can apply. Maybe it's only a small business under the small business program that we talked about a couple weeks ago. Maybe it is, an institute of higher education. If so, then we're good. So we need to make sure that we're looking at the solicitation to see if there's a limit on the type of institution that can apply. So I mentioned earlier, I asked Sylvia about the R15 program, the area program. With the NIH Academic Research Enhancement Award, the R15, there's actually a limit on the types of institutions that can apply based on the amount of NIH funding that they get. So CSU is actually excluded from this program. I worked with a faculty in our wow, I'm blanking now if she was communications or psychology. Anyway, I worked with a faculty here who had actually found this solicitation that she really, really wanted to apply to, but it was an R15 program. We're not eligible. We found the similar program under NIH that we were eligible for. That was an R01, so she applied to that one instead. But just be aware that sometimes the type of institution is limited. And then the agency might put limits on the PI. Like by stage of the career, it could be an early career, or even the number of submissions that they can be a PI or a co-PI on. So that's something that we want to be aware of and ask those questions of our investigator. You're going to be PI on this. Are you a co-PI on anybody else's proposal internally, or are you on somebody else's as a sub-awardee? And so examples of programs that have those limitations are the NIH area program. Again, with NIH area program, the investigator cannot have a current R01 to be able to apply for the R15. And then the NSF early career program actually limits by how far out from the PhD, what stage of career the investigator's in. So all of that should be in the solicitation. And again, if you're somebody responsible for a pre-award, you should be reviewing that. But also for the purposes of the exam, know that there are these types of program limitations. Any questions on those? I think they're pretty straightforward, but okay. Conflict of interest. Yay, I have a lot of slides on conflict of interest. And again, Kim, feel free to chime in. What I'm not addressing here is conflict of commitment. When I think of conflict of commitment, I think about two things that can't occur at the same time, like the calendar invitations, right? You can't have two things scheduled at the same time. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about when there are interests that are outside somebody's employment that could have undue influence on that individual's actions or judgment. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about conflict of interest. And the rules and regulations that are out there on conflict of interest are primarily around financial conflict of interest. So that's what we're talking about because of the purposes of the exam. There is a lot of chatter right now about conflicts of commitment and different types of non-financial conflict of interest that you'll want to be aware of. But again, as far as what's out there in agency regulation, the most has been written on financial conflict of interest. So that's the only thing I've included in these slides, which is kind of enough because you'll see the slides. There's like a lot of slides on, I think a lot of slides on these. So I'm not going to read these to you. Know that the threshold there can change. Is that threshold still accurate, Kim? Sorry, I'm going to put Kim Melville-Smith on the spot.
Yes, it's still accurate at the federal level.
It's still accurate at the federal level. I know that changed years ago, so that's something that we'll keep an eye out on. If that level does change, Kim will certainly let folks at CSU know about that level changing, right? Kim, or is Shannon Pipes doing? She's doing some conflict of interest stuff as well, right?
She's actually CSU's conflict of interest officer.
Okay, so she'll let us know, right? Between the two of you, you'll let us know.
Yes.
Okay, so here, oops, sorry, let me back up one. Okay, so if you read in this bottom, oh my gosh, it changes when it shouldn't and doesn't change when it should. Okay, what the regulation actually says is significant financial interest as defined as greater than 5,000 annual income or equity. Okay, so what do we mean by, or what do they mean by significant financial interest? So you should have this definition. Maybe this is one of your flashcards. What is significant financial interest? So it's the value received from an entity in the 12 months preceding disclosure. Again, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but it gives that aggregate value of that $5,000. And it gives some examples like consulting fees, honoraria, paid authorship. Okay, but it also includes equity interest, okay, ownership interest. And so any of those that exceed that aggregate threshold is actually the federal definition right now.
Hey, Tricia.
Yes.
I have a comment on that one.
Yes.
That I think a lot of people miss. And that is also that it includes reimbursement for travel.
Yes.
And
Yep.
so it doesn't have to be actually any cash or anything like that. It can just be
paid for
costs
on behalf
paid on
of?
your behalf. So
Yes.
internationally, that racks up pretty fast.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think on our conflict of interest policy at CSU, we specifically call out travel, right, in that policy. Or in our, not our policy, but in our, I'm sorry, when we go to report conflict of interest, we call out travel in our reporting.
We have it kind of in this mash similar to what this definition is, and so it gets overlooked as well.
Okay. Okay, because I know when I fill out mine, I have to think about travel that Incura pays on behalf of me when I go to, you know, I'm on the Incura board of directors right now, and they actually pay for my travel back when we were traveling. So I have to report that on our conflict of interest disclosure.
I have a question.
Yes.
Would it be a conflict of interest if say a PI that typically bids on a project through CSU, but an RFP comes out that only small businesses, say, can apply for, and he has that small business on the side? Would that be a conflict of interest?
Yes, potentially. That's something that should be disclosed. Sorry, Kim, I should have let you jump in. There could potentially be a conflict of interest, and it's certainly something that they should disclose, is what I'm going to say. Kim, what are you going to say? Kim lost her microphone.
Sorry,
that's okay.
lost I couldn't get it unmuted.
I understand.
So yeah, it could be, but again, it just needs to be a managed conflict. So for most conflict of interest, it just needs to be disclosed, and that way everyone has full knowledge and can manage it properly.
Okay, so it really just needs to be disclosed in their COI, and that's something that they can go from there for anything further.
Right. So each award that does similar tasks could have potential where the disclosure needs to be submitted to the sponsor. But the only way we can do that is if we start with it internally.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
What sorts of management, what would your management plan look like in that situation?
In that situation, if the award was given to the small business and the PI of the small business happens to be a CSU employee, and some of that money then came to CSU, we would have CSU list somebody. So there would be somebody else at CSU in charge of that subaward project.
Okay.
Good questions. Thank
Now, would that other person that was in charge of the subaward project, if they were then given remuneration from that same company in the future for,
Sorry.
for their participation, then both sides would have to disclose, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks for the question, Sylvia. You don't have that situation at your institution, I'm sure.
Today, in front of my face.
In front of your face. Okay. Okay, so financial conflict of interest. Again, there is conflict of interest regulation that's listed in the catalog of federal regulations, promoting objectivity in research. The interesting thing here is this regulation applies to institutions and to investigators. So you're going to see several slides on institution obligations and investigator responsibilities and obligations. The other thing that when I started digging into FCOI that I found interesting is that this isn't just limited to the principal investigator or project director or key senior personnel. It applies to all individuals who are responsible for the design, conduct, and reporting of research. Now, typically that's somebody like with a PI, co-PI, senior personnel role, but not always. So I think that's something to be cognizant of. So investigator, what are some of the investigator responsibilities around FCOI? Is first of all, the investigators need to follow institutional policies and procedures. Okay, investigators should complete FCOI training prior to conducting NIH research and every 4 years after. There may be other agencies that have FCOI training requirements as well. And also they must submit those significant financial interests, not only for themselves, but for spouses and dependents. This one I ran into at my former institution where there was an investigator who he was over a senior capstone. The senior capstone group had spun off and created a company, and the company was trying to sell something back to the institution. And I asked the investigator, I said, well, you don't have any interest in the project, do you? And he's like, oh, I don't, but we put it in my wife's name, so that's okay. I was like, no, it's actually not. You still need to disclose that. So it's not just for the investigator, but it's also for spouse and dependents. Anything that you would add to that? I have another slide. I'll come back to you in a second, Kim, in case let me do the other slide and then you can say if there's anything that's missing under investigator. Investigator must make the disclosure no later than the time of first application for NIH funded research. And if they have a new or acquire a new significant financial interest, let's say they get married, and now all of a sudden their spouse has an SFI, that once that happens, they have 30 days to report that, and they should be reporting annually. Is there anything else that you would add to investigator responsibility under FCOI?
The only thing I would add is this slide makes it seem like it's mostly NIH focused. Mm-hmm. The only thing that's really specific for NIH is that FCOI training that needs to be done every 4 years. Otherwise, all of the rest of this is applied to all the federal agencies.
Okay. Yeah, this information actually comes out of the NIH FCOI training. And if you all have ever done that, I thought, oh, it would be just a real quick, easy. It's not. It's a long and kind of involved, but there's a really, really good NIH training video on FCOI where they go through all of this. So thank you for that. Okay, then institution obligation. So institutions should create and maintain written and enforced policies that comply with regulations, which have to be publicly available or they have to be made available, and that they are supposed to be informing their investigator of the institution's policies and the investigator's responsibility, and then also requiring that the training. And there's more, of course, there's more. There's like 3 or 4 slides of institution obligations. There should be an institutional official who is responsible for soliciting and reviewing disclosures. And that investigators must disclose to the official. And disclosure must happen no later than the submission of the application. So that's something at CSU, at submission time, we're looking to see if that information has been submitted or not. And then I think there's 2 more slides on this. Investigators to submit an updated disclosure yearly. Again, we'd already mentioned within 30 days of acquiring a new significant financial interest, and yeah, and more, right? Must provide guidance that's consistent with the regulations. And the very last slide says we have to take steps to manage any FCOI, because remember, we're just the requirement is for reporting potential conflicts of interest. Then the institution has an obligation to review those, determine if there is a conflict of interest, and if so, they have to put a management plan in place. And so this is an annual process that has to occur. So a lot of information there. There's a lot of information around FCOI. And again, that institution obligation versus the investigator obligations. So I don't want to just read slides to you. This one is just basically summarizing some of the things that were in the other slides. And here at time of application, if you don't remember anything at all, remember this, that at time of application, that the institution has an effective, up-to-date, written and enforced process. Okay. Anything else that you would add, Kim?
No, that covers it pretty good. There's nuances to
so
CSU.
much, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's nuances to CSU, so we won't get into those.
Okay. Okay, and Kim mentioned that, you know, the slides are really NIH heavy because it really, you know, a lot of this came out of NIH and the training is in NIH, but there are a number of agencies that actually require adherence to this regulation, the PHS regulation, and those, again, I'm not going to read them to you, and this list can change. So I don't know if an agency would fall off, but definitely agencies can be added. Are you going to have to remember all of these agencies? No. Do know that this applies broader than just NIH and that this is a PHS regulation for the purposes of the exam. So what we have like 5 pages here of agencies. If you've ever gone in, and hopefully you have, at least at CSU, and done your disclosure, there's actually a place where you can get an updated list of the agencies. So this is important if you have an investigator applying to one of these agencies, that they may at time of submission have to make sure they're in compliance with the regulations. So don't worry about memorizing them all. I just wrote them here for impact so that you knew it was not just NIH. Okay, any questions?
Hey, Tricia, the
Yes.
one on here that I think kind of sticks out for me is the Susan Komen procure. It's not really, I don't ever think of that as a federal agency under PHS.
Yep. Yes, a lot of these actually on this slide I wouldn't think of, but they all require adherence to the regulation. So that's a good point, right? When you're looking at some of these, but yeah, so it's important that our investigators are doing their disclosures and that they're, you know, that we're aware of these, especially if you're somebody that is helping to review and submit proposals. Other comments or questions? Okay, thanks for that, Kim. Appreciate it. Okay, so I mentioned State Review Executive Order 12372. So this may be required for certain types of applications. Not all states participate in this intergovernmental review process. So I mentioned, folks, if your whole career has been here at Colorado, you might be used to selecting C, program is not covered, right? Or actually, that's a kind of a different question. Program is not covered. The program might not be covered versus the institution might not, or the state might not participate. But typically we would select C on there. So the states that actually require this intergovernmental review are listed on the next slide. So I was in Kentucky for a lot of my career before going to Ohio. And we did participate in this requirement. So for certain federal programs, they were typically research programs. When we were making applications to those programs, we had to submit copies. At the time, it was like we had to submit a dozen copies to our state single point of contact. And then the state would look and review those proposals and basically tell us if we were allowed to submit the application or not. Because what they were looking for at the time was to make sure that institutions within the state weren't competing with each other unnecessarily, and that we were working collaboratively rather than in competition with each other. There was one time in my dozen years in Kentucky that we were told no to pull the proposal and at the time I was at Western Kentucky University, because University of Kentucky was already doing a similar program and had similar infrastructure in place. So I think fortunately, when I moved to Ohio, I was really glad we didn't have to do this. I'm glad we don't have to do this in Colorado. But it's something that you should be aware that some states actually participate and require this intergovernmental review. So ideally, we were supposed to submit copies of the proposal in advance of submitting to the federal agencies. Ha ha ha, right? We typically submitted our copies about the same time to the state that we submitted to the federal. So we actually one time had to then turn around and withdraw a proposal from the federal agency. So if you think it's hard to get an investigator to internally submit, can you imagine if you say, oh, you have to back this up several weeks so our state can review? Yeah, that was something that didn't happen, at least not at my institution. So just be aware of this requirement.
So just for interesting little piece, since we are Utah, I've only seen us selected for review on one proposal with the Economic Development Association that did have that clause that it had to be reviewed by the SPOC prior to submission. But then it had a nice little clause that said, but if you don't receive a response, just upload a document saying the date that you requested it, and that will suffice.
Okay.
I thought that was really interesting that, yes, you got to disclose, but we don't really care. And then when the SPOC he did respond quite quickly, and he just said, no.
And was it just like an email submission to one person? Is that all you did? So in Kentucky, there was actually a review board, and we had to submit like a dozen copies. And at the time, paper copies that we had to mail. So
wow.
And so Sylvia was saying SPOC, S-P-O-C, the single point of contact, or state point of contact.
Right.
Yeah. So that's what she's talking about there. So just, again, be glad you're not in there, but be aware of this, that some states do require. Again, are you going to have to memorize what states? No. And states can kind of opt in and out at different times, but you should be aware that some states do opt into this and require this level of review, and not for every program. Okay. Certifications, representations, and assurances, okay, for contracts, okay. And we haven't really talked too much about differences between grants and contracts, or have we? I can't remember, but we're talking here about contracts rather than assistance. So representation, certifications, and these are actually federal acquisition regulation requirements that any entity wishing to apply for federal contracts have to complete. So what this is, there are certain provisions that we certify to, certain statements, right? And these are typically done by like a point of contact at your institution. Here at our institution, Ashley Staley is actually the one that goes in and reads all of these certifications and does a formal attestation or confirmation in sam.gov that basically says, to the best of our knowledge, and she reads through all of these and has to check whether they apply or not. So you have somebody at your institution that is considered your government point of contact. If you go in and look at these on sam.gov, that system for award management, CSU's was like 52 pages, like of certifications and representations that we as an institution have to read through or appoint somebody to read through and say if they apply or not. So this information is all logged in SAM.gov. And they have to be annually updated. So every year, your government point of contact will have to go in and certify and update those. Luckily, it's nothing that we have to do as individuals, or you don't have to know every single type of certification or representation. The ones that are listed here are very common ones that you should be aware of, though. So lobbying. And I think I have a whole nother slide on lobbying, so we'll come back to that. I mentioned debarment suspension already, that your institution or your investigators are not debarred or suspended from doing work with the federal government. So that debarment and suspension is basically, again, just saying that the entity is not presently debarred, suspended, or proposed to be debarred or declared ineligible for entering into government contracts. For the lobbying, sorry, I thought I had a slide on lobbying, but I don't think I do. So let me just back up here and go to lobbying. The Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995. This is certification regarding payments that could influence that federal transaction. And basically, we're saying that we as an institution have not used federal funds to pay or planning to pay a person to influence them to give us a government contract. Does it mean that we can't have a lobbyist? No, it doesn't. No, we never call our people lobbyists, but institutions do hire people to lobby on their behalf. We're just saying that we're not using federal funds to pay those lobbyists and that we are disclosing if we've lobbied for a program. When I was at Western Kentucky, we used a lobbyist, again, a congressional liaison, we called that person, not a lobbyist. We did not pay that person with federal funds, but we used them and actually received a number of congressionally directed contracts and awards to our institution as a result of that lobbying. That was allowed as long as we disclosed it. So we actually had to fill out the standard form LLL that said, yes, for this program we have lobbied and that we did not use federal funds. So I think for most of us, you know, we don't even fill out the form because we're not lobbying and we're just putting not applicable on that form. Okay. The agency and program specific requirements for drug-free workplace, that comes from the Drug-Free Workplace Act of 1988, which requires federal contractors and federal grantees to say that they will provide a drug-free workplace as a precondition of receiving the grant or contract. So that is different than the drug-free workforce. We cannot guarantee that all of our employees are drug-free unless we are drug testing. Okay, so we should not be agreeing to drug-free workforce, but we can say that we are a drug-free workplace. So that's something just to be cautious that if you're somebody who's signing an application, you know, or signing a contract, that it's actually the drug-free workplace requirement and not workforce requirement. Okay, and then finally, non-discrimination. This is based on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that says no person in the U.S. On the grounds of race, color, national origin should be excluded from participating in a federal program and receiving federal assistance. So if you are somebody who is an authorized organizational representative and you have the authority to sign proposals or to sign awards and enter your institution into a contractual arrangement, you should definitely be aware of all of these different types of assurances that we attest to in SAM.gov. And also a lot of times these are written on the cover page of the grant that we're submitting, or of the proposal we're submitting, or of the contract that we're signing. Okay, signature authorities. I just mentioned that there's an authorized organizational rep. Hopefully there's a list at your institution that says who can sign different types of documents that enter your institution into a legal or contractual arrangement. So there might be different signature authorities for submitting proposals as opposed to signing legal agreements or signing award documents. Okay. And then the e-business point of contact. You will have a e-business point of contact at your institution. I'm trying to think of what else I want to say on that. I'm trying to think of who that person is at CSU. I want to say Chris Carson, but I could be wrong on that. So this is typically for your federal submission systems, where you have an e-business point of contact that goes in and defines those AOR rules for you. And that's why I'm thinking here at CSU, it's Chris Karsten. So if you need to be set up, say, in grants.gov or research.gov to be able to submit and sign proposals, then you would go through your e-business point of contact. Okay. Signature authorities. I just showed this page. This is from CSU, so this is nothing that you'll need to know for the exam, but what I wanted to point out here is that there are different individuals who are authorized to negotiate contracts versus signing contracts, signing award agreements, signing things like MTAs. So again, there should be some kind of list at your institution that says who can sign proposals, who can sign contracts, who can sign particular award documents or particular agreement types like an MTA. We have these publicly available. That way, if a sponsor wants to know if somebody is authorized, that way they can readily see it. And actually, Bill Mosley, one of our senior research administrators, had an issue with somebody who came back recently on this because they didn't see that individual's title listed here. So we are actually working on some of the language and to update. Our list is grossly out of date. So we're actually working to update that list in conjunction with legal counsel. Okay, any questions just on certs and reps and some of the big ones to be aware of for the exam, like lobbying or drug-free workplace? Are people at their max? We're getting in the home stretch here. Let's quickly talk a little bit proposal submission. A lot of proposals now, particularly federal proposals, are going through some type of electronic submission system. You should be familiar with the acronym ERA. I'm sure you all already know, Electronic Research Administration. You should also be aware of at least the NIH and NSF and grants.gov, the submission systems on this page. So grants.gov is that submission portal for federal financial assistance applications. Okay. It used to be you would download a PDF package, but now there's a workspace that you work in. NSF is still using FastLane for some types of submissions, but they are transferring things over to research.gov, and research.gov is taking on more and more capabilities for different types of submissions specific to the National Science Foundation. And then the NIH has all of their ERA is here under this tab. Assist is the interface for proposal submission. And then the NIH Commons is used for some of that just-in-time information, like other support and any budget modifications, and also for the research performance progress reports, the RPPR. So just being familiar with some of the big agencies and their submission systems. And the systems go beyond just submission. They also might be used for reviewers to actually review applications. They might be used by post-award to issue awards and for drawdown of funds. Okay. I also had just a couple other that you might want to be familiar with. The Easy Fed Grants, which apparently is not very easy, which is the USDA portal. which allows for proposal submission and award management. And then NASA has a system, the Inspire system. And that, again, is for submitting proposals. It also is used by NASA for proposal review and some post-award management. So that brings us to merit review, but it also brings us to our time together. So we are going to cover merit review next time. And then we move into grants and contracts and some of the language around grants and contracts that you'll want to be familiar with. There was a quick homework here, which I'm going to give you, and I will actually send this to you in an email following this. So, but if you could watch one of the videos on the merit review process that's listed here, either for the NIH or the NSF, that would be great. And then just a reminder, if you haven't submitted your annual conflict of commitment or conflict of interest disclosure, to please make sure that you've done that, because that's something that administrative professional staff at CSU as well as faculty actually responsible for doing. So I'll send this out. Next time we'll go through merit review, we'll go through some of the just-in-time information, and then we'll move into grants and contracts. So we're doing pretty good on time here. Any questions here at the end? We're a minute over. Are we good? I'm going to stop the recording.
Thank you very much.